Okay. Our next speaker is Denis Galvin, currently retired. Thank you. Retired as Deputy Director, National Park Service, and he will be speaking to us about growing the system, new designations, and urban strategies.
Yeah, I got a watch too. I'm such a fossil. I even have a pocket watch, and I'm going to look at it. Oh, I see we got 23. This is like doing a congressional hearing, except hopefully they won't buzz you off at the end of 5 minutes. So it's growing the system, new designations, and urban strategies. Subtitle: I ain't going to talk about Yellowstone. Subtitle: The National Park Service Deconstructed. I don't know how many sessions I've attended, this one included, in which people stand up and say, the mission of the National Park Service is the Organic Act of 1916, unimpaired, all that stuff. True, but incomplete. In the 2006 management policies, the mission is stated in 2 sentences, not one. The first sentence is the Organic Act, or a restatement. The National Park Service preserves the unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. The second sentence is, the National Park Service cooperates with partners to extend the benefits of natural and cultural resource conservation and outdoor recreation throughout this country and the world. And those are based on laws, by the way. The Park Service didn't make them up. So you've got the Act of August 25th, 1916, but you also have a slew of outdoor recreation acts passed in the 30s. You've got the National Historic Preservation Act. You've got the National Historic Sites Act. And I don't have to tell a room full of lawyers that they have the same force and effect as the Organic Act. Now, as we look into the growth of the park system and we look into the 21st century, that second sentence is going to become more and more important, because the likelihood that we're going to add another Yellowstone to the system in the 21st century is very low. Gary Mackless and I were talking the other day, and probably the only place the Park Service is going to add a lot of federally owned acreage to the system is through Defense Department closures, base closures. There are some excellent resources out there that probably could enter the park system that would be owned in fee simple. But for the most part, the parks that come in are going to be like the parks I've talked about that have come in sort of in the last half of the 20th century. The reason cooperation, of course, is important, everybody's been talking about that, and the reason these other programs that the Park Service runs are important is they extend the reach of the agency into the places where people live. So the Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Association isn't bound by the boundaries of parks. It can go into communities in Idaho and save rivers. It can go into downtown Los Angeles and encourage the construction of trails. And for the future of conservation, it's pretty clear that if people don't practice conservation where they live, it's not likely they're going to hope for, support conservation in areas that are remote from them. Now, why did Bob ask me, and by the way, I'm privileged to be here and thank everybody associated with the Stegner Center for asking me to be here. But why did Bob ask me to be here? Well, he knows that I've spent the last 4 or 5 years, first with the Second Century Commission, chaired by Senator Baker and Senator Johnston, and then under Gretchen Long's leadership, who was here yesterday, as part of a subcommittee of the National Park System Advisory Board, worrying about what a plan for a future national park system would look like, which we produced a report called Planning for a Future National Park System, a Foundation for the 21st Century. By the way, this is a paper. If anybody wants the paper, my email address is dpgalvin01@msn.com, dpgalvin01@msn.com. Gretchen tells me there's a pile of these in some closet in Washington, John. And if you'd like one of those, I'll see if I can get you one, because much of what I say is in the report. The conclusion of both of those exercises, the Second Century Commission and the Advisory Board, is there's room for robust growth in the national park system. First, let's look at the existing system. It has some deficiencies. It is 13% rock and ice and only 3% wetlands. My guess is, just thinking about acreages, about 2% of those wetlands are in one place, the Everglades. It is 91% west of the 98th meridian. For those of you who forgot your grammar school geography, that's the eastern boundary of Colorado. If you exclude Alaska and Hawaii, the number becomes 73% west of the 98th meridian. The distribution is not equitable. There are 100 acres of national park for every citizen of Alaska, while there are almost 1 million citizens for every acre of national park in Illinois. In a study of the Northeast writ large, sort of from Virginia north, including Pennsylvania, all of New York, all of New England, New Jersey, so that's kind of the Northeast. It's not New York, New Jersey, and New England as frequently it is. The Nature Conservancy came to this conclusion about the Northeast. Any way that it is measured, securement, I mean protection, for nature is largely limited to slopes, high elevations, and granite or sedimentary rocks. Flats, floodplains, low elevations, limestone, sand and shale, the centers of diversity in the region, are largely and mostly unsecured. It is striking to look at a map of protected areas, and they're all about mountains. We have done a great job of protecting ridges, mountains, forests. And if you look beyond parks, if you look to forests, refuges, state parks, they tend to be in the same place. They tend to be western. If you add up state parks, refuges, national parks, and forests in California, it adds to 33% of the area of the state. If you do that in Kansas, the number is 4%. So they're great. Some of the maps that have been shown, there's great slugs of green in the western third of the country and a virtual void in the middle of the country, and a few little slices of green along the Appalachians in the east. So there's a lot of work to be done on the distribution of parks. It's similarly true for the cultural inventory. The Park Service has a thematic outline for history they adopted in 1994. It's things like peopling places, shaping the political landscape, creating social institutions and movements. NPCA did an analysis recently that showed shaping the political landscape was represented by 115 units, 21%, while creating social institutions, the kind of things that Audrey was talking about, is only 3%, 16 units. Peopling places is represented by 126 units, 23%. Expanding science and technology, imagine how important that is to the history of our country, 15 units, 3% of the system. So there's a tremendous potential for growth on the cultural side, too. We looked at national historic landmarks, those places not necessarily owned by the Park Service, but that have been judged nationally significant. There are over 2,000 of them. 21% of them were put on the landmark register because they're architecturally significant. 9% represent politics and government. 7% were military themes. Those that showed less than 1% representation: communications, economics, Hispanic themes, Native American themes, performing arts, philosophy. In all, 12 themes have less than 1% registration. So you look at the current inventory, it's not adequate on the natural side, and it's not adequate on the cultural side. So what did the National Park Service Advisory Board say to the Park Service about this? We made 18 recommendations, but I'll translate them into English for you. It said, develop the capacity to do a plan. The last time the Park Service did a plan was 1972. When you think about the kind of tools that, for instance, Healy showed us this morning, the analytical tools that are available now, it would be a very different approach and a very different kind of plan now. So, develop the capacity to do a plan. Do a plan. Look at large landscapes and touch urban populations. Those are the sort of our four. The 18 recommendations all fell into those four categories. Urban programs. Why urban programs? Well, the answers are obvious. 81% of us live in an urban area right now. The projection for 2030 is 87% of the United States will live in an urban area by then. So the fate of the nation's conservation lies in cities. There's no question about it. And fortunately, the National Park Service has more urban presence than most agencies. There are national recreation areas in Atlanta, Los Angeles, New York City, San Francisco, Chicago, and Boston. Major historic footprint in parks in cities like Philadelphia, San Antonio, Washington, D.C., Seattle, St. Louis, and New Orleans. And yet, an analysis by the NPCA found that 23 of our 50 largest cities lack a significant national park presence. So there's room for more park programs in cities. There's also room for more parks in cities. But to return to my original theme, they're not going to be Yellowstones. They are going to be different formulas. So now I'm going to turn to some legislative models from the past to give you some idea of, I think, what a rather skillful job Congress has done adapting to local situations. Recently, I was lunching with a colleague, and he said, we need new models for new times. And my response was, nobody's looked at the models that we've done in the last 50 years. Let's go back and look at them and see how they work. So I'm about to do that. Well, the first two aren't very new. Canyon de Chelly, and speaking of the Antiquities Act, at Canyon de Chelly in Arizona, the Congress passed a law that told the president, you can do a proclamation to create Canyon de Chelly, and Hoover did the proclamation that created Canyon de Chelly. But an important proviso in both the proclamation and in the law Congress passed with the consent of the Navajo tribe. That happened in 1931. The Park Service still does not own an acre in Canyon de Chelly. We are still there at the sufferance of the Navajo tribe. It's been a rocky relationship at times, but it's all still in place after nearly a century. The second historical example is Cape Cod, 1961. It's hard for me to believe that that's over 50 years ago. By the way, I've picked most of these examples because I've got hands-on experience with them, one way or another. There's lots of other ones, too. Cape Cod, two things important about Cape Cod. One is it's the first time Congress ever told the Park Service, if you got the money, you can buy all the land to create this seashore. Okay, somebody mentioned yesterday, everything up to, Destry mentioned yesterday, everything up to Cape Cod was essentially carve it out of public land or buy it with somebody else's money, philanthropy, or in the case of Smokies and Shenandoah, state money. But the other reason Cape Cod is interesting is there was a ton of private property, residential property within the boundaries of the seashore. What are we going to do about that? About 500 private properties within the boundaries of the seashore. So the legislation said the Secretary is going to set zoning standards. And when the Secretary sets zoning standards, the towns have to adapt the zoning standards to meet the Secretary's zoning standards. And then if individual property owners meet the zoning the local zoning, they will not be condemned. And in fact, people are given certificates by the secretary that says you're exempt from condemnation. Now, if they, and we've actually taken people to court over this, if they do something that violates the zoning, they are subject to condemnation. Now, that's worked. There were, roughly 500 properties 50 years ago when the law passed, and there's still, maybe 450. Sometimes willing sellers sell to the Park Service, but for the most part, that's worked. So some more contemporary examples. Boston National Historical Park. So you got 7 historic sites scattered around downtown Boston. Some of them are federal, some of them are state-owned, some of them are owned by the city, some of them are private. How are you going to make a national park out of them? What the Congress said to the Park Service is, you go in there and develop cooperative agreements with all 7 of those sites. And the language in the statute says, the Secretary shall not acquire any such properties by eminent domain so long as he determines that a binding written cooperative agreement assuring the preservation and historical integrity of such properties remains in force and effect. So then they went in there and cut deals. Park Service owns some of the sites. Park Service has a visitor center and a city-owned building. Some of them have remained private. The Park Service has fixed up some places owned by private in private ownership. It's worked. Pinelands National Reserve was sort of a million acres in central New Jersey. Important aquifer protection, huge bunch of open space available for outdoor recreation in a heavy urban area. The federal legislation directed the state to establish a planning entity to develop a comprehensive management plan for the area. And then it authorized federal funds for the state to buy land, not for the feds to buy land. And that's worked. Destry was telling me yesterday at lunch, they just had a big controversy where they were going to put a pipeline right across the middle of the most ecologically sensitive part of the Pinelands. And by a 5-4 vote, the Park Service having 1 vote on the commission, conservation values prevailed. Santa Monica Mountains. Santa Monica Mountains is a fairly typical, fairly ordinary piece of legislation, authorizes the Park Service to buy land and everything, but it created a mountain zone in which the state and local governments have jurisdiction, and what it's resulted in is a kind of mosaic of ownership. So you've got let's see, you've got 100, right now you've got about, in 1 million acres, you got, 155,000 acres, federal land ownership is only about 1/7. But you've got intense cooperation between state, local, and federal entities in managing that area. Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, 72 miles of the Mississippi River running from the headwaters to downtown Minneapolis, St. Paul. The legislation noted a lack of sufficient coordination in the area and set up a coordinating commission. It was created to do a plan. That's beginning to sound familiar. It included authority for federal land acquisition if local efforts are inadequate. The Secretary actually has authority to condemn. Imagine condemning something in downtown Minneapolis, ridiculous. But it worked as a stick to make the place successful. And today, the federal, in a 54,000 acre corridor, the federal government owns 62 acres, all of which was federally owned before the park was established. And if you're familiar with Minneapolis, St. Paul, I flew the river the night after the first meeting. And, this was, what was 1988. Like so many 19th century cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul had turned its back on the river. It's industrial. If you go to that city today, the Guthrie River's down there, there's all kinds of residential. An old railroad bridge has turned into a trail bridge. There's a state park on the river. It's been a dynamic change. Museums, theaters, the city has turned towards the river and uses it as an amenity. The Presidio Trust, when Golden Gate was established in 1972, Phil Burton put a little piece in the bill that said if the Presidio ever becomes surplus to the needs of the Department of Defense, it will become part of Golden Gate. So in the 80s, or the early 90s, when the Defense Department, BRAC, it's called, Base Realignment and Closure Commission, said the Presidio was going through a partial closure, the place would become an automatic part of Golden Gate. Now here's a place with 2 hospitals, a research center, 1,000 residences in downtown San Francisco, a big public health service hospital, a research center. And so the Park Service decided we need something like the old Pennsylvania Avenue Development Commission there. Our vision was it would take care of the real estate, and we gave it all kinds of authorities that the Park Service doesn't have. Exemptions from federal procurement regulations, ability to issue bonds, ability to collect interest, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of that effort, the Congress flipped, and Frank Murkowski became the chair. He put in 2 provisions that the Park Service hated. One was that the place had to be self-sufficient, and if it wasn't self-sufficient after 15 years, it would be essentially auctioned off by GSA as federal surplus property. At the time, the California delegation that I was working with said, we'll take it, it's never going to happen, and the trust was established. It's been something of a rocky history. It's essentially a government corporation, but the trust today is self-sufficient. The Presidio has succeeded. Those 1,000 residences, people live in them. They pay top dollar to live in them on a lease basis. And I think it has to be judged a success. 2 other examples, Boston Harbor Islands. And by the way, the Presidio legislation says it will be managed as part of Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Most of these pieces of legislation I'm talking about say that they generally will be managed according to the laws that govern the National Park Service. So the Organic Act does come into play here. It's a kind of complicated legal question. Boston Harbor Islands, 30 islands in Boston. The Congress set up a partnership of which the Park Service is only one member, and directed the partnership to do a plan, and then directed that that the plan would be managed by the partnership. Park Service, again, has only one seat, and it's worked. The Park Service provides educational and interpretive services, runs a downtown visitor center. Finally, heritage areas. Since 1984, the Congress has created 49 heritage areas. In that same time, they've created 32 national parks. Let me read a definition of heritage areas. National heritage areas are places where natural, cultural, historic, and scenic resources combine to form a cohesive, nationally important landscape arising from patterns of human activity shaped by geography. These patterns make national heritage areas representative of the national experience through the physical features that remain and the traditions that have evolved in them. These regions are acknowledged by Congress for their capacity to tell nationally important stories about our nation. So we're dealing with living landscapes here. For almost the first time in conservation history, Congress is saying, you go in there where all these people live and develop important stories and preserve important resources. And I think it's sort of a tragedy that the conservation community has largely ignored these heritage areas when it is clearly the political choice to deal with large landscapes in this country. The latest issue of National Parks Magazine, which is outside on the NPCA table, has a wonderful article on the Essex National Heritage Area. 500 square miles, 750,000 people living in it, more 17th century houses than exist in all of the national park system and probably all of the United States, all privately owned, all with people living in it. the largest salt marsh in New England, rich maritime history, rich industrial heritage, all essentially being run by a nonprofit with 2 national parks there, Saugus and Salem. So my time's up. Now what? Huh?
We'd like to take time for questions.
Yeah, sure. Time for questions, yes.
You mentioned the relative lack of large acreage parks in the Northeast. What is the status of that proposed national park in the state of Maine, with a donor willing to give much of the acreage?
Well, Michael Kellett's here, so he could probably answer better than I, but I do know the status of it. That park is very much in the tradition of Acadia. A private individual has bought almost 60,000 acres of land that she's willing to transfer to the National Park Service, would be transfer probably Antiquities Act, and create a new Maine Northwoods National Park. There has been a lot of local opposition. It's around Millinocket, south of, what's the name of the mountain at the end of the Appalachian Trail? It's great stuff. And my view is that it will come in eventually. But right now, there's a lot of local opposition. Even though, Acadia is, probably 3 hours away, and just a proven example of how successful national parks are in driving the local economy. But I think we're going to get it. I worked on the Burn series as a consultant, and there's a little cameo in there that talks about Steele, the guy that was the spirit behind Crater Lake. And the cameo is he's a farm boy in Nebraska. His lunch is wrapped in a newspaper, and he opens up the newspaper and he reads about Crater Lake. It's the first time he's ever heard about Crater Lake, and the years aren't going to be right, but they're close. Then it's 20 years before he sees Crater Lake, and then it's 20 more years before Crater Lake becomes a national park. So these things take time, but they're always worth doing.
Questions?
Yes. Wait for the...
Kate, take the one right next to you.
Oh, okay, way up there.
Denny, thanks very much for your talk and for your sharing the experiences of older models that seem like they'd be very adaptable to the future. You're embracing creativity and diversity of national park models. Is there anything that you'd put off the table? Is there a particular model, be it purely conservation easement park or something else that you think just shouldn't be considered or would not be workable?
Well, for the most part, no, but in the planning for the future of the national park system, we do sort of draw a line, and the best example is the fossil site in Waco, Texas, in which I guess a local congressman drafted a bill that said, yeah, this is going to be a National Historic Site or whatever, and the Park Service is not going to spend a dime on it. And I'm confident that the Park Service opposes that legislation, as well it should. I mean, the important heritage areas are different than the examples that I cited, because most of the examples I cited, including Boston Harbor Islands, have something in it that says they'll be managed according to the laws generally applicable to the national park system. Heritage areas say quite the opposite. They say no new federal rules or regulations, no National Park Service stuff. But the brand, the Park Service brand, is incredibly important in heritage areas. I've got some publications here. Like there's Essex. There's the brochure for Essex, huh? Black band, Helvetica bold, no arrowhead. Map, just like, map of Essex County, just like a map of the National Park Service, so that the Park Service brand is incredibly important in heritage areas, but heritage areas are not bound by Park Service laws or federal laws generally. What you're doing there is inspiring local people to conserve the things they want to conserve. And it's very, very, very powerful. I have a lot of personal experience with these areas, and you're not telling people what to do, you're saying, what do you want to save? And that is an important question for almost everybody. Everybody has an answer to that question. One more. I got more time? Wow, I did all right.
Well, everybody wants to save something, and you mentioned that large landscapes like Yellowstone weren't really possible anymore.
Well, fee-owned large landscapes.
Right, but
federally owned.
there has been little or no mention in this conference of the greater Canyonlands area. Given local opposition, congressional leadership or lack of, and extractive industry lobbying, it's probably a huge job, but I don't see why we can't continue to work together in the partnerships that have been suggested in finding creative ways to save one of the large areas that is federally owned land in a variety of areas.
Agreed. I mean, NPCA is for it, Southern Eastern Wilderness is for it. John won't say he's for it, but he is. And it is, I mean, look, it's still possible to carve fee ownership out of public lands. I'm just saying it is unlikely. And then you got to think of the 2/3 of the country where there are no public lands. What are you going to do there? So I'm for expanding the Canyonlands, and I'm for expanding other parks that are surrounded by public lands. But it's not a model that's going to work in a lot of the country in the 21st century.
The microphone's up here, and it's our last question.
Oh, up in the, hey, Michael.
Hi,
Here's the
Denny.
guy that
Thank you
should-
for the plug for the Maine Woods.
You want to answer that question on the Maine Woods?
No, you answered it very well. I'm just, you sort of elaborated there, but in terms of new Yellowstones, as you know, there are a lot of potential areas that could be new Yellowstones: Infi, the Tongass, San Rafael Swell, the White Mountain National Forest, Apalachicola. But I assume you're talking about political reality, but that's really the political reality today. So, and we talk about the magic of the national parks. Do you see that it's possible to change that political reality and get a bunch of new parks in the next 20 years, say?
Well, it's a complicated question, but I was doing some calculations this morning. There's 401 parks, units of the national park system, not counting heritage areas, or wild and scenic rivers, or long distance trails, or all those other wonderful programs that protect important parts of the country that aren't counted as units. And so 478 parks divided by however many years it's been, what is the 128, 142, 140, so 401 parks divided by 142 years is between 5 and 6 units per Congress, okay? So each Congress, on average, has added 5 or 6 units to the national park. Now, I did this calculation some years ago, and I looked at the history of it by decade. And the history is that you have Congresses or administrations that say no more growth in the national park system, and you go along, and it's below the average. It's, for the last couple of years, it's been 0 or 1 or 2, and that's happened before. What typically happens at some point at the end of that is you get 10 or 20, and then the average goes up to 5 or 6 again. And David Brooks, who's the Chief of Staff for the Natural Resources Committee in the Senate, tells me that there are 100 public land bills backed up in the Senate. Many of them non-controversial, by the way, boundary adjustments and things like that. Eventually that dam will break. And it's going to take, I don't know, it's going to take a change in the Congress for sure, but Congresses do change. People retire, philosophies change, presidents change, and the Park Service, the park system, continues to be favored by the American people, and I think the chances for growth are good. Now, the second part of the question is, growth from other public land agencies, I think, is going to be much slower. It's very difficult. John alluded to that yesterday. Certainly, there are areas in the national forests and areas owned by BLM that have the characteristics of national parks, but the politics of that are different than adding units to the national park system. because there's a whole bunch of executive branch politics that goes along with it in addition to the congressional politics. Okay? Thank you.